Okay, everybody. Last video we talked about devices in general, Windows 10 devices. We talked about the fact that we used to just be worried about them being joined to an on-premise domain, and then we talked about the three databases that a device could be in the cloud now, because now everybody's moving towards the Office 365, the Azure cloud. On the domain, we would join a device to the domain and it would create an account on the domain. How did that help us? And what advantages did that give us? Well, really the number one thing it gave us is single sign-on. If my computer joins the domain, then I can log on using a domain account. And then I get from the domain something called a Kerberos token. Now, Kerberos token was, let's just call it a key. It's my main key to get to everything else on the domain. So once I got that on my Windows 10 device, if I went to some other server, file server, web server, database, or whatever, if that server also belonged to the domain, then I could prove that I was part of the domain through that Kerberos token, and I could get access automatically, single sign-on, to that server or any other server in the domain, or any server in a domain that my domain trusted, because domains could also trust each other. In fact, we put all of the domains that trusted each other into a larger entity called a forest. And even forests could trust each other, so we could actually expand this ad infinitum if we wanted to. So that's where it really helped us with single sign-on. What about any other kind of proof, device proof? Yeah, Microsoft started putting that into the domains around 2012 R2. They started having or allowing you to create condition-based access to resources, and one of the conditions was you were sitting at a computer that belonged to the domain. You could even have a bring your own device machine as well. That was a way to do that. You can use those as conditions, so you could have done that. It was a little complex and wasn't a common thing. Even before that, there was another way to do it. Since computers had their own account on the domain, they would actually log on before you logged on. When a computer logged on, it would get a Kerberos ticket that it could use. Didn't use it for a whole bunch of things, but one of the things you could use it for is this. We could actually create a situation on the domain, we could still do this, where we tell all the domain computers that they must use IPsec and they must authenticate. IPsec is an encryption protocol. It doesn't have to do total encryption, though. It can actually do signing. It's a way to prove you are who you say you are. It uses public-private key encryption, which makes it available for that. So we could actually tell all the computers, don't talk to another computer unless you can negotiate a Kerberos session with it, and not just any Kerberos session using any key, or IPsec session. Don't talk to any other computers unless you can negotiate an IPsec session with that other computer, and not just any IPsec session. The IPsec session has to use Kerberos tickets, and it has to use Kerberos tickets that came from the domain. So putting all that together, you could create a situation where you only allowed your computers to talk to each other if they had already authenticated to the domain, meaning they were members of the domain. So you could cut out communication with non-domain members. Again, a difficult thing to put together, but very effective. Not a super common thing that would happen, but plenty of companies did it, and it worked very well. The problem with it is that you would end up kind of screwing it up or not thinking ahead, and you would get denied access, and you would lose functionality on the domain, as always is the case when you're weighing security against usability. One of those suffers. So we could use that back in the day for domains. Switching ahead to the cloud world, we can also use the device in the cloud, the device's object in the cloud, to make authentication decisions. In the cloud, we have Azure Active Directory. And a Windows 10 device can register itself with the Azure Active Directory service. The terms that are used when it gets into that service are a little confusing. So we'll go over them briefly right now, and then we'll discuss them further in another video. I'm trying to make these videos fairly short so that they don't go on forever and you don't get bored and go do something else. But the states that a Windows 10 machine can have an Azure Active Directory are Azure Active Directory joined. That's I would say the best one. That's the one we strive for. That means a device is joined only to Azure Active Directory. Azure Active Directory knows about the device. When the device boots up and a user logs on, they immediately get single sign-on to the Azure Active Directory, and they get something called a primary refresh token automatically sent down to their computer, and then they can use that to get to any resource that Azure Active Directory covers, yes, including Exchange and SharePoint and all that kind of stuff. So the user logs on to their device with their Azure AD account, their Office 365 account. They don't log on with another account and then use a secondary logon to get to the cloud. They're actually logging on to their device to the cloud first. Right? That's Azure Active Directory joined. There's another lesser one that I kind of just hinted at called Azure Active Directory Registered. This is when you have a Windows 10 device and it hasn't been joined to the cloud first. It's just an independent Windows 10 device in a work group, right? Remember a video I talked about before about work groups? That meant the machine was just independent, didn't belong to anything. Well, a machine that belongs to a work group, you have to log on to an account on the device itself, some local account. Then you can start up Outlook or Teams or something and authenticate against Azure Active Directory. And when you do that, Windows 10 does a little trick. It tries to register your device with Azure Active Directory. It's kind of a secondary authentication scheme. And if that happens, what happens then is a user will boot up the machine, they'll log on as that local account, and then they'll start Outlook or Teams or whatever, and Windows 10 will authenticate them against Azure Active Directory once that happens. And again, they get actually a primary refresh token. It's generated in a slightly different way. It doesn't really matter. We don't have to get into the mechanics of it, but they do still get a primary refresh token, and that token that they got for Outlook can then be used for Teams and everything else using that account. So it sounds good, like, well, that sounds almost as good as the Azure AD join. Yeah, for some instances it is. It's just getting plain access to your mailbox and Teams, yes. But when we dive a little further and we want to start limiting authentication and using conditions-based access, it does matter quite a bit. The third way a Windows 10 device can be registered in Azure AD, and I use that term registered to refer to all three methods because Microsoft uses it. It's a registration service in the cloud. It's unfortunate that one of the methods is actually called Azure AD Registered devices, but it is what it is. So the third way is called a hybrid Azure AD join. Hybrid Azure AD join. This is an odd one. This means the device is joined first to an on-premise domain. Then it's also joined to Azure AD. Now the only way this really works is if when you log on with a username and password that's valid on the domain, and that same username and password is also valid in Azure AD. Now this is the common thing because, well, if we have a domain, we're probably syncing user accounts to the cloud, including the user account and their password hash, so you will have that situation. So a hybrid Azure AD joined Windows 10 device, that happens not by accident. We have to set that up. It's not something you do on the Windows 10 device though. That's something you have to set up on the domain. We actually have to tell our domain computers, hey, go ahead and do this hybrid Azure AD join so you'll be in both places. That sets up a situation where we get single sign-on on the domain, and then we get single sign-on in Azure AD and Office 365 and all that just by signing in to our Windows 10 device. So that sounds good too, and it is. That's if I was going to rank them in what we want to strive for from top to bottom, Azure AD would be first, hybrid Azure AD would be second, and then just Azure AD Registered would be third. Why hybrid not the first one? Well, we want to try and get away from domains, and if we get rid of the domain, your machine is still hybrid Azure AD join. That's a problem because its primary authentication is against the domain. What that basically means is if the domain doesn't exist, sooner or later you won't be able to log onto that machine, even though your Azure AD account is fine. So that's a problem. So we would actually have to reset that machine and rejoin it straight up to Azure AD. That's the only huge problem with it. In my eyes. There's some other minor things. So we'll talk more about each one of these in some other videos. This one was a little long, sorry about that, but stick with me. I'm going to try and keep them short. I'll see you next time.